Stephen Wesley Mosher was born May 9th, 1948 in Scotia, California. He grew up in Fresno. He has undergraduate and graduate degrees in biological oceanography from the University of Washington. After he had served in the Navy, he studied the Chinese language at Chinese University of Hong Kong. Then he earned graduate degrees in Asian Studies and Anthropology at Stanford University. In his book, Broken Earth, Steve wrote about forced abortions in China to accommodate the one-child policy. He is the author of 9 books, and he and his wife, Vera, have 9 children. He is president of the Population Research Institute, an internationally recognized authority on China, and a regular contributor to WSFI Catholic Radio. He is a convert to Catholicism. He is a pro-life activist, and right now he's our speaker.
I was supposed to be here a year ago, but I'm not going to apologize for my absence because it wasn't my fault. It wasn't Angela's fault either. It was nobody's fault in the United States that we went into a year of confinement, of lockdown, of mask wearing, and for some of us it's still not over, sadly. I don't really include myself in that because I'm from the free state of Florida. Not to gloat, you understand, but no, we didn't go into a lockdown there. I remember last May I sat down with the mayor of Fort Myers, and he said, you know, some people want a mask mandate down here in southern Florida. What do you think? And I said, well, we are free people living in a free country. I think people ought to be able to decide for themselves whether or not to wear masks. If they feel more secure wearing them, they should. If not, they shouldn't. And he slammed his fist on the table, and the vote in the city council was 3-2 against the mask mandate. So we've all been in this struggle together, as it were, for the last year, and I've been struggling to write a book about it. The book is called "The Politically Incorrect Guide to Pandemics." Now, I'm a pretty politically incorrect guy to begin with, but it's hard to hit a moving target, and we're still living through this nightmare. But it is coming to a close. I think with all the news that's coming in from around the world, with even countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore abandoning lockdowns. China now is the only country that's still pursuing lockdowns. No surprise there, right? They're a one-party totalitarian dictatorship. They love this stuff. The more power they have, the communists have over their people, the more they enjoy it. But we are free people again, and we should be in charge of our own destiny, including our own health care. I was told I should probably start by talking about what happened to me in China all those years ago. I was the first American social scientist allowed into China. We normalized diplomatic relations with that country on January 15th of 1979. I was on the ground in China in March of that year. I was part of a contingent of 50 American social scientists, not social scientists, but scientists in general, who were allowed into that country. Now, the other 49 were all, strangely enough, nuclear physicists and chemical engineers and other people in the hard sciences. And China was eager to have them come to their country so they could pick their brains, so they could learn the latest in science and technology. They were not eager to have an inquisitive social scientist from Stanford University who can speak, read, and write Chinese in their country. And so they turned down my research. They said, no, we're not going to accept him. And it was only after my research proposal was brought up in a meeting between China's leader, Deng Xiaoping, and President Carter, that the Chinese gave the go-ahead. Well, once Deng Xiaoping said I was okay to come in the country, all doors were open to me, including the door to the local hospital, where by March of 1980 they were doing cesarean section abortions of women in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. In assembly line fashion, mind you, there were lots of women in the people's commune I was living in who had been arrested for the crime of being pregnant without permission with a second or third or fourth child. The one-child policy was just beginning at that time. And they were all told they had to have an abortion. Many of them refused, but refusal was not permitted. Those who refused were simply arrested, held, given brainwashing sessions that lasted weeks until they finally submitted to the procedure, and then were brought in for forced abortion. I was in the operating room when they were doing forced abortions and forced sterilizations. Now, I was not a Catholic at the time. I was not even a Christian at the time. I was not pro-life. I was at Stanford University. What do you expect? But when I saw what an abortion was, the tiny child who was being sacrificed in this modern-day human sacrifice, the death of a tiny son of Adam or daughter of Eve, it was clear to me instantly that this was the taking of a human life. This was no mere clump of tissue. This was a human being who had every right to life, and it was being denied them against the wishes of their own parents, the father and mother, who, of course, in all cases were heartbroken by the forced abortions. And then, of course, to add insult to injury, they would sterilize the women after that to make sure they didn't come back the following year with another illegal pregnancy. So they took these women out of the childbearing business altogether. Two things happened to me in that room. First of all, I became pro-life, as I mentioned. The second thing is that I realized that there must be a God. Now, how can you get from witnessing a forced abortion in the third trimester of pregnancy to a belief in God? Well, you get there by realizing that hell exists. You get there by realizing that evil exists, because there's no more evil act than killing an innocent child in the womb or just after being born. The taking of an innocent human life. In these circumstances, it was as if the pit of hell had opened up before me. And I realized that if a great evil like this could exist in the world, that there had to be a compensating good. Because if there wasn't, then the universe was mad. And I didn't want to live in a madhouse. So I came to believe that there was a source of good, and if you seek the good, you'll be led to God, who's the source of all goodness. It took me a long time. I'm a very slow learner when it comes to some very important things, but I was called by Father Paul Marks in probably 1984. Father Marks, many of you know, was a longtime head of Human Life International and also founded Population Research Institute, which I'm still the head of today. And Father called me on the phone. He was the first priest I'd ever spoken to in my life. I was a little nervous. But he had an offer to make me. He said, I'm holding a conference in Washington, D.C., and I'd like you to come and speak about what you saw in China. And I didn't hesitate because, quite frankly, the people I thought were my friends at Stanford had all turned away from me. My fellow professors at Stanford, those who didn't want to go to China and do research, were joined by those who were in favor of population control, like Professor Paul Ehrlich, and they all wanted to get rid of me. Not one stood up for me. So Stanford and I parted company, and no one on the left was listening. I actually was so naive in those days that I went to the National Organization of Women, thinking that they would be horrified by what was being done to women in China. Forced abortion, forced sterilization. What happens to my body, my choice? And you know what they said to me? They said they listened to my story. They looked at the pictures I showed them. They listened to the audio tapes. They heard the evidence, and they said, well, we're personally opposed to forced abortion. But after all, China does have a population problem. Goodbye. So no one was listening. And when I say no one was listening, no one was listening on the left. And then I get a call from Father Paul Marks, who in his soft voice said, I'd like to invite you to a conference in Washington, D.C. I immediately accepted. Then he dropped the hammer. He said, I can't afford to pay you, but you can bring some of your books and maybe you'll sell a few. I went anyway. Found myself in the midst of the most warm, loving, kind-hearted people that I had ever met. People who were involved in a struggle on behalf of unborn children who would never be able to thank them in this life, for which they would never receive any reward in this life, often just calumny, often just attacks. And I wanted to be like them. I certainly didn't want to be like the professor at Stanford University. So that's how I came to know you all in the beginning. And year after year, Father Marks would invite me back to his conferences, and I always went, even though he didn't pay me. It became difficult. You know, the children started coming, and I had to produce some income. But he eventually called me in 1995 and asked me if I could come to work for him in Washington, D.C., and I've been interested in leaving California. Any of you who've been in California know why I was interested in leaving California, the land of fruit and nuts. So when he called, my wife and I took it as an answer to prayer. And we talked for a long time about what we might do together at the Population Research Institute, expanding the reach of pro-life work around the world. And then, of course, he dropped the hammer again. He said, "Can you work for free?" I said, "No, Father, you may be a Benedictine monk, but I have a wife and 5 children. I think number 6 was on the way, and no, I actually need to make a salary." So we came to an agreement that I would take a pay cut and come to join him in Washington, D.C. And at the wonderful 15 years of collaboration, he was the chairman of my board until 2010. That was the year he passed away. He passed away, I think, in what you can call the odor of sanctity, because he'd been very ill the last few weeks of his life. He was in the hospital in St. Cloud, Minnesota, couldn't move or speak. And in the middle of the night, in presence of 2 witnesses, he sat straight up in bed, raised his arms to heaven, and said, "Take me home." Now, he couldn't have done that in the natural. So I believe that the angels or saints or someone special, the Blessed Mother, came to him and said, "Are you ready to come home?" And he said, "Yes, take me home." So that was the great Father Paul Marks, who helped to bring me into the Catholic faith, taught me the faith, taught my wife and I natural family planning, which is how we wound up with all these children. My wife does thank him. So I'm going to talk about the China virus today. And some of you may have heard the World Health Organization refer to it as SARS-CoV-2, which is almost unpronounceable. And the disease itself is COVID-19. Because, you see, they don't want us to talk about where it actually came from. And it came from China. Am I getting the pronunciation right? China, yeah. So, that's Brooklyn for you. I'm not going to read. I have a book here, and anyone who's interested in learning more than you ever wanted to know about the pandemic and past pandemics can order a copy from us. It's called The Politically Incorrect Guide to Pandemics. I'm just finishing up the last chapter now. But I just wanted to go over quickly some points that I made in Chapter 9, which is called, not to give away the store, China Releases an Unrestricted Bioweapon on the World. That's what the chapter is called. Now, I wouldn't call it that if it weren't true. But the Chinese Communist Party virus, or which I will call the China virus for short, was made in China. Now, you know, it's usually difficult, if not impossible, to pinpoint a pandemic's point of origin, especially when they spread rapidly. You never know exactly when it originated, when it crossed over from animal to human, where it came from, where the mutation or recombination came from. But it turns out that in the case of the novel coronavirus, the China virus, it's obvious to everybody that it came from Wuhan, China, right? And I believe that it was created in the lab, and there's lots of evidence for this, in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the product of genetic engineering. The Chinese Communist Party's bat story never really flew, okay? Never. A bat did not fly 800 miles from a cave in Wuhan and land in someone's soup at the Wuhan seafood market in 2019 and was eaten and then conveyed the coronavirus to a human being. Didn't start there. That was a fairy tale told by the Chinese Communist Party. So what that means is the pandemic that we have been living through the last 2 years is a man-made disaster. And the men who oversaw the bioweapons research that gave rise to it are the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, starting with the party's leader, Xi Jinping himself. So that's where it began. We actually had another SARS epidemic a few years ago. People may remember back in 2002, 2003, we had the first SARS epidemic, SARS being short for a coronavirus. It came from bats. Patient zero of the first SARS epidemic was a snake seller in China's Guangdong province in southern China, who came down with the disease on November 16th of 2002. He died shortly thereafter, but hundreds of cases were soon being recorded by Chinese health officials. But get this, true to form, in 2003, the communist regime lied about the disease for months. They silenced whistleblowers. They doctored the data. They duped global health authorities and even accused outside forces of carrying out a bioterrorist attack. That's 2003. They did not inform the World Health Organization in 2003 about the outbreak until 3 months after it started, and then only because Canadian intelligence had detected a flu outbreak in progress in China. Now, does that sound familiar to anybody who's lived through the last 2 years? Yes, because they did exactly the same thing a little over 2 years ago. So what happened, though, with that first SARS epidemic was this. The people in charge of bioweapons in the People's Liberation Army realized that a coronavirus, which is what SARS-1 was, a coronavirus, could kill a lot of people, and that it might make a very effective bioweapon. So it caught the eye of China's bioweapons experts, who I believe thought if they could just make a deadly SARS-related coronavirus that was more infectious than the original one, they would have a very potent weapon on their hands. The first one couldn't be propagated by in aerosol form. It couldn't be transmitted through the air by breathing and sneezing. The second one could. And then the story gets very interesting because it involves the United States. In 2017, there's a woman in China, China's Batwoman, called Dr. Shi. Dr. Shi Zhengli goes into a joint venture with Peter Daszak of EcoHealth Alliance. Peter Daszak gets his funding from Dr. Anthony Fauci. And they begin to work together to track down the original SARS virus back to the original carrier, the cave-dwelling horseshoe bats of Yunnan province. And then Batwoman goes crazy. She begins to collect dozens, hundreds, 1,500 coronaviruses from the horseshoe bat from these caves. Why? Because she's looking for a bioweapon. She's looking for a SARS coronavirus that is highly infectious, not just deadly like the first one was, but highly infectious as well. They have more viruses in the Wuhan Institute of Virology than identified more viruses than the rest of the world combined up to a few years ago. So they were carrying out a massive collection program. Now, I believe the Chinese Communist Party knew about the pandemic that was brewing in Wuhan for a long, long time, because I don't think it just started in January when they began to tell the world about it. I think it started months before that. But it refused, just as it had a few years before, to tell anybody that they had a major epidemic on their hands. The World Health Organization covered up for China as well. Once China told the World Health Organization didn't tell the world until a number of days later. When the word finally came out that there was a dangerous epidemic brewing in Wuhan, Chinese officials claimed there were only 44 cases in early January, They claimed that it came from the Wuhan seafood market because of that bat flying into someone's bat soup. They blamed it for the outbreak. They insisted they had not yet identified the pathogen responsible, unknown virus, and that no healthcare workers had been infected, and that there had been no, and this is key, no human-to-human transmission. All of those things were lies, just as they had all been lies 15 years, 17 years before. Every single claim was a lie, and every single claim meant that we lost time in dealing with this new dangerous pandemic. It turns out, of course, as we all know, it's a highly transmissible airborne coronavirus of considerable pathogenicity, not as deadly as SARS-1, but dangerous to the elderly. So I won't go into how the World Health Organization served as the press corps for China. We all know that. That was why Trump, quite rightly, cut off funding to the World Health Organization last year, because they completely abandoned their responsibility to the people of the world to help protect them against precisely what had just happened in China. I believe their funding should not have been restored as it was by the Biden administration recently. So we've had an investigation of Wuhan lab, right? We actually had the World Health Organization go in and check out to see what was happening in the lab. No, we didn't. We had a guided tour by hand-selected, Communist Party-approved experts from around the world who went to Wuhan for 3 weeks. The first 2 weeks they were locked up in quarantine in hotel rooms. How well can you carry out an investigation when you're locked up in quarantine in a hotel room by yourself? Not very. The last week they were given a guided tour. They were only allowed in the Wuhan Institute of Virology once for a couple hours. They were not given any of the original data. So the World Health Organization has been useless in helping us. So the virus was spread from Wuhan quite deliberately after it had taken root there, and we'll get to why it took, how it got out of the lab in a minute. But right before the pandemic reached the rest of the world, the Chinese New Year had taken place, and every year the largest migration in the world takes place in China. 200 million Chinese go back to their native place or they go overseas. There was an epidemic brewing in Wuhan. 5 million people left Wuhan, many of them carrying the virus. Many of them went to places like New York. They went to places like Milan, Italy, Spain, other places on vacation. And they took the virus with them. The effect was to spread the virus to all corners of the world. It was quite deliberate. It was quite deliberate. The Communist Party knew it had an epidemic brewing. It allowed people to travel around the world, using them kind of as human disease vectors to spread the disease to the rest of us. So I wrote about the lab. I think I was one of the first to write about the lab in February of 2020. And I said, look, China has an epidemic. The lab is right there. Chinese labs leak all the time. They have a terrible safety record. As soon as the outbreak in Wuhan began, the Chinese People's Liberation Army bioweapons expert descended upon Wuhan and took control of the situation. It's one of their projects, I said. For this, I was banned on Twitter for a long time. So President Trump, of course, suggested on April 15th of 2020, last year, that he had seen information suggesting the pandemic had started at the Wuhan Institute of Technology, or rather, Wuhan Institute of Virology. And Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, seconded the idea. But Fauci, the famous Dr. Anthony Fauci, said no. He moved quickly to head off the danger. He loudly and publicly, Fauci did, dismiss the possibility of a lab origin of the China virus. He cited as evidence a February 16th article in Nature magazine that said the virus had natural origins and that any of us who were saying otherwise were nothing but conspiracy spinning conspiracy activists. This gets us into the weeds a little bit here, but remember Peter Daszak? Remember Anthony Fauci? How this worked was Anthony Fauci wanted to do dangerous gain-of-function research in the United States to take coronaviruses and make them more deadly and more infectious. Why would you do that? Well, Anthony Fauci said in a Washington Post article in 2010 that we want to do gain-of-function research to make dangerous pathogens in the lab so that we can anticipate viruses that might come one day from nature, and so we can develop in advance of the next emergent pandemic from nature, we can develop vaccines, we can develop therapeutic drugs, and we'll be ready when the next pandemic happens. Well, that's all fun and games in the lab until you create a superbug in the lab, and before you have a vaccine and before you have therapeutic drugs, it escapes from the lab, or it's deliberately released from the lab. So more prudent people than Fauci said, this is a really dangerous idea, let's not do this. And so in 2014, there was a moratorium placed on this research. Fauci was told to take his $8 billion annual budget, I said $8 billion annual budget at the National Institute of Health of Infectious Disease, and spend it elsewhere. Don't spend it on gain-of-function research. So gain-of-function research was stopped in the United States. Fauci was very unhappy. He wanted to continue the research, and so he went to Peter Daszak of EcoHealth Alliance, and he gave him a huge grant, and Peter Daszak went overseas to the one country that really didn't have good lab safety protocols in place, that really doesn't care about human life, that forcibly aborted hundreds of millions of women over the last 40 years, that is currently harvesting organs from political prisoners in eastern Turkestan and selling them to the highest bidder, that is committing every human right violation that you can imagine on a daily basis. Yes, EcoHealth Alliance, Peter Daszak, took Fauci's money and went to China to continue gain-of-function research. And not only that, that woman was invited to come to the United States to learn the latest in gene splicing techniques, the cutting-edge technology that you and I, taxpayers, had paid for to develop. And she went to the University of North Carolina, to Ralph Barrick's lab there, where he taught her to do insertions in coronaviruses that could not be detected, that left no trace. She also went to the University of Texas Galveston Laboratories, another high containment lab, to learn additional techniques. And armed with U.S. information, U.S. knowledge, U.S. scientific techniques and genetic engineering, and supported by U.S. taxpayer dollars, and secretly supported by the People's Liberation Army, she began doing her research. And we're living through the result of this research. Now, I don't think that Anthony Fauci had any idea that any country in the world would take gain-of-function research and use it to develop a dangerous bioweapon. I think he thought he was simply trying to advance the frontiers of knowledge. He was simply trying to actually do what he thought he was setting out to do, and that is to anticipate these dangerous pathogens that might be emerging from nature, create them in the lab, and then create a defense against them. But how do you think China's People's Liberation Army bioweapons experts saw this? Do you think they saw this as an opportunity to protect humanity or to attack humanity? I think the answer to that question is obvious. China's gone through a lot of stories about the origin of the virus. They first claimed that it came from bats. Then they said no, maybe it came from a little scaly anteater, or maybe it came from moles or other animals. And then they said, well, my favorite is this. Communist officials then said that it was an American bioweapon that was deliberately released in China. They said that the SARS-CoV-2 was an American bioweapon. It was created in the U.S. Army's research labs in Fort Detrick, Maryland. And how it got to China was the U.S. athletes who participated in the World Military Games in October 2019 brought it to that city. And they deliberately released it on the unsuspecting people of Wuhan. Well, here's where the story gets very interesting, because oftentimes, as you know, when criminals are trying to explain away their acts, they inadvertently give away interesting facts. And I believe that the China virus was ready to go by, at the latest, the spring of 2019. It was ready to be released on the world, but it only lacked one thing, and this is a vaccine to protect the Chinese military and the Chinese citizens against it. Because as Major General Chun Wei, the head of the bioweapons program, the People's Liberation Army, said, if you have a spear, you need a shield, right? And the spear was the China virus. But they needed a shield, because if you release a bioweapon on the world and you haven't first protected your own people, you're going to cause a lot of damage to the Chinese population, especially to the Chinese military. And so they had the China virus ready in 2019, and they set about developing the shield, the vaccine, which they would then use to vaccinate their own people prior to releasing it. That takes time, as you know, to develop an effective vaccine. And sometimes when you're in the process of developing a vaccine, and if you don't care about human life, you can actually use it in human challenge trials. You can vaccinate people and then expose them to the deadly pathogen, and if they live, then your vaccine is successful. If they die, you just refine it and use the next group of human guinea pigs. I think it was leaked out in Wuhan in the late summer, early fall of 2019 in human challenge trials. At the same time, remember the World Military Games in October of 2019, when you had thousands of athletes from around the world, including from the U.S., Canada, and European nations, go to Wuhan and participate in the military games in athletic competitions. Many of those athletes came back sick with an unknown flu, an unknown pneumonia, an unknown virus. A third of the Canadian delegation of athletes was quarantined in the back of their plane as they flew back from China to Canada, again with an unknown virus. We didn't have a test for it at the time. We didn't know what it was. So I think that the Chinese also released it on the athletes who went to the World Military Games. So when they say that our athletes brought it to Wuhan and released it on their athletes, actually the truth was the reverse. It was the People's Liberation Army that released it on the athletes. And then, of course, they went back to their native country, and the China virus began to spread. That's what I believe happened over the last 2 years. The sad thing is that we now have an administration in Washington, D.C. that does not appear at all interested in getting to the truth of the matter about where the virus came from and how it was released. It has no interest in making the Chinese Communist Party pay for having killed roughly 5 million people around the world and hundreds of thousands of people in the United States. We have instead a government which is participating in a cover-up, I believe, of these kinds of things. And I say that deliberately because Mike Pompeo, whom I know, in the summer of 2020, when the pandemic was just beginning in the United States, set up a team at the State Department, under direction from President Trump, set up a team at the State Department to get into the origins of the China virus. And they, by January of 2021, this year, had reached the conclusion that the China virus did indeed come from the Wuhan lab and was a bioweapon that was released on the world. That team was instantly disbanded as soon as the Biden administration took office. Not only that, their report was never released. It was simply secretly discarded. When it came out in May, several months later, that this investigation had been secretly canceled, On the same day, I think, as damage control, the Biden administration announced they were going to embark upon a 90-day investigation to find out where the virus really came from. You see, they secretly canceled it. When it became public, they started another one with great fanfare. We're going to get to the bottom of it. Well, they didn't get to the bottom. They came back 90 days later and said, we really don't know where it came from. It might have come from a bat. It might have leaked out of the lab. We don't know. Both wrong. Wrong, wrong. Didn't come from a bat. Didn't leak. It was designed in the lab. It was deliberately leaked from the lab. But again, we have people in office who don't want to get to the bottom of this. There should be accountability. China should pay for the tremendous cost in terms of human lives, not just in the United States, but around the world. Tens of millions of jobs lost, millions of businesses shuttered, trillions of dollars lost in economic terms. And of course, there should be accountability for people like Dr. Anthony Fauci and Dr. Peter Daszak and others who were involved in doing this research and involved in the cover-up that followed and is still continuing today. I mean, you understand that Dr. Fauci is in the White House as the chief medical advisor for the president, even now. So that's what happened. There's a lot more to say about this. It gets us into genetics and genomics and all kinds of things that would just put you to sleep at this point in the evening. So let me just end by saying this. The China virus is an unrestricted bioweapon. And what do I mean by unrestricted bioweapon? That's not my term. That's a translation from the Chinese. When you think of a bioweapon, you think of something like SARS-1, which has an 11% fatality rate, or you think of something like Ebola, which has an 80% mortality rate, or you think of something like anthrax, a couple of pounds of which could kill, if properly distributed or improperly distributed, could kill 1 million people in a city. But that's not what an unrestricted bioweapon is. An unrestricted bioweapon, and this is what the China virus is a bioweapon that's designed to be highly contagious, but often symptomatic. And we know that 60% of the people who get the China virus don't have symptoms. They don't even know they had it. My son had it. He didn't have any symptoms at all. He's 33, the one who had it. So it's highly contagious, but often asymptomatic. It has low lethality, which the China virus is a severe flu. It has a case fatality rate in the United States of between 0.02 and 0.03%, 0.2 and 0.3%, which means it's a severe flu. More severe than the ordinary annual seasonal flu, but something more along the lines of the Asian flu of 1958 or the Hong Kong flu of 1968. All right? It's not the Black Death, not the end of the world. So, highly contagious, low lethality, but it produces uncontrollable variants, and above all is not easily traceable back to its origin, that is, back to China. The Chinese Communist Party wanted plausible deniability to ensure that it could claim that it had nothing whatsoever to do with the pandemic that followed. And such bioweapons are designed, according to the Chinese strategic literature, to be deployed in advance of a declaration of war to weaken the enemy, or to be released for international strategic gain or political gain. And I don't know if you realize it, but 2 years ago, China was back on its heels. We had tariffs going in. We had put a check on the ongoing cyber espionage. We were building up our alliances in Asia. China was suffering in many ways, and I believe released the bioweapon, the unrestricted bioweapon, in order to gain some advantage over the United States. And of course, it succeeded beyond, I think, even their wildest dreams. Because look at the consequences. They got the president in office that they wanted. They have an administration that appears now ready to back off on the tariffs, that appears ready to release Chinese spies and drop charges against them, all of which has happened. and appears ready to allow technology transfer to continue to go to China. And every technology that goes to China has both a military and a civilian use, just like the genomics technology that we foolishly allowed to go to China. So we have had the release of an unrestricted bioweapon. The devastation that followed it is unprecedented, I think, in human history. All of this happened without China having to fire a single shot. And so from that point of view, the China virus has turned out to be the most destructive weapon in human history. And we're doing nothing about it. Thank you. So if anyone wants to know more about China, it's all in Bully of Asia. I have a few copies with me. It's a donation of $20 to Pro-Life Apostolate.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephen. My wife and I have bought the book, and we're eager to read it.